What if one of Europe's most mysterious ancient peoples was not erased by history, but hidden inside our DNA this whole time? What if the Dacians, a name most textbooks reduce to a Roman footnote, are suddenly speaking again through modern science? Tonight, we are diving into a discovery that is quietly shaking the foundations of European history. Scientists are uncovering genetic clues that force us to rethink who the Dacians were, where they came from, and why they matter far more than we were ever told. This is not a nationalist story. This is not a myth revival. This is a human story written in bone, stone, and sequence data. This is Scientists Discover the Extremely Shocking Genetic Origins of the Dacians. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. These mini-documentaries take weeks of research, careful sourcing, and precise writing to bring the past back to life without distortion. If you care about ancient history, human origins, and the science that is rewriting everything we thought we knew, you're in the right place. By subscribing, you help this channel stay independent, curious, and fearless in asking the hard questions history left behind. For most people, the word Dacian barely registers. Maybe you've heard it once in passing, linked vaguely to Rome, conquest, and a place somewhere in Eastern Europe. And that is exactly the problem. The Dacians have been framed almost entirely through Roman eyes. Their enemies wrote their story. Their cities were dismantled. Their language vanished. And for centuries, that silence was mistaken for disappearance. But silence does not mean extinction. It often means survival without a voice. And today, that voice is emerging from an unexpected place. Ancient DNA. If you stand in Rome and look up at Trajan's column, you see what looks like a stone spiral frozen in time. But think of it differently. It is a carved film reel, showing war scenes, fortresses, negotiations, and faces. Those faces belong to the Dacians, bearded, defiant, distinct. Rome immortalized them in victory, yet erased them in memory. The column became their shadow archive. And for a long time, that was all we had. Until genetics stepped in and asked a dangerous question. What if the Dacians never truly vanished at all? Because the real shock is not that scientists can extract DNA from ancient bones. The shock is what that DNA might reveal about continuity, mixture, and identity in one of Europe's most contested regions. The Balkans and the Carpathian Zone have always been crossroads. Armies marched through, traders passed by, empires collided, but crossroads do not erase people. They transform them, and the Dacians may be the clearest example of that transformation hiding in plain sight. The Dacians did not appear out of nowhere, and they were never a fringe tribe hiding in the mountains. They occupied a vast and strategic region centered around the Carpathian Mountains and the lower Danube Basin, a zone that today overlaps mainly with modern Romania and neighboring areas. This land was rich, defensible, and impossible to ignore. Ancient writers knew it. Roman generals feared it. Yet modern popular history barely mentions it. The Dacians are often reduced to a single moment, the wars against Rome, as if they existed only to be conquered. That framing is convenient, but deeply misleading. It turns a complex society into a dramatic obstacle and nothing more. When history is told this way, entire civilizations shrink into footnotes, not because they lacked importance, but because they lacked surviving voices. Much of what we think we know about the Dacians comes from outsiders. Greek authors describe them in fragments. Roman historians describe them as threats. Both filtered Dacian life through their own political and cultural lenses. Everyday Dacian voices are missing because their language was never preserved in long written texts. That absence created a vacuum, and myths rushed in to fill it. Over time, the Dacians became either romanticized mountain warriors or forgotten barbarians, depending on who was telling the story. Neither image reflects reality. They were farmers, metalworkers, traders, and organizers of complex communities. But when a people leave few inscriptions, later generations often assume they left little else behind. That assumption would prove costly. Rome, however, could not afford to underestimate them. The Dacians controlled resources Rome desperately wanted, especially gold. They also occupied terrain that made invasion slow, expensive, and humiliating. Before Trajan, Roman campaigns against Dacia ended in uneasy compromises rather than clear victories. This was not a weak opponent. It was a regional power that forced the empire to pay attention, and when Rome finally did, it made sure the world remembered its triumph, even if it meant the Dacians themselves faded from the narrative. That remembrance is carved, quite literally, into Trajan's column. Rising in the heart of Rome, it wraps the Dacian wars into a continuous stone narrative. Soldiers march, fortresses burn, leaders negotiate, and again, Dacians appear, not as faceless masses, but as individuals. Their clothing differs from Roman uniforms. Their hair and beards follow distinct styles. Their fortifications look unfamiliar to Roman eyes. This is not accidental. The column unintentionally preserves Dacian difference. It shows a people Rome considered worthy of detailed depiction, not just symbolic defeat. In a strange way, Rome's propaganda became the Dacians' most enduring archive. For historians, Trajan's column functions like a visual time capsule. It hints at social organization, military tactics, and daily life, even though it tells the story from the victor's point of view. What it does not show is what happened before Rome arrived, or what survived afterward. It freezes the Dacians at the moment of conquest, as if time stopped there. That freeze shaped centuries of thinking. If the story ends in defeat, people assume the people ended too. But history rarely works that cleanly. And that is where the danger of Rome's spotlight becomes clear. When one empire shines too brightly, everything outside its glow appears to vanish. But shadows do not mean emptiness. They mean there is something standing between the light and the ground. And for the Dacians, those shadows were only the beginning of a much deeper mystery, one that archaeology hinted at, but could not fully unlock. Because beneath the ruins and reliefs, another record was waiting. And it was far older, far quieter, and far harder to erase. To understand the Dacians, you have to let go of the idea that they were a temporary obstacle on Rome's frontier. Long before Roman legions crossed the Danube, the Dacians had already built a durable and organized world. Across their territory, archaeologists have identified fortified settlements positioned on high ground, often using steep slopes, stone walls, and wooden reinforcements. These were not random refuges. They were planned strongholds, connected to surrounding communities and landscapes. Their placement suggests strategic thinking, control over movement, and an understanding of both defense and communication. A society that invests in fortifications like these is thinking long-term, not living in the shadow of imminent collapse. Beyond stone and timber, the Dacians were skilled metalworkers. The region they controlled was rich in mineral resources, especially gold and iron. Mining was not incidental to their economy. It was central. Tools, weapons, and ornaments found in Dacian contexts show advanced techniques and consistent styles. Gold was worked not only for trade, but for status and ritual. This metal wealth connected Dacia to wider trade networks that reached far beyond the Carpathians. Goods moved, ideas moved, and with them, people. That circulation challenges the old image of the Dacians as isolated highland warriors. They were participants in a broader European economy, not spectators. Language offers another glimpse, even though it survives only in fragments. Most scholars agree that the Dacian language belonged to the Indo-European family. Where exactly it fits within that family remains debated. Some see it as closely related to Thracian languages spoken farther south. Others argue for clearer distinctions. The truth may lie somewhere in between, shaped by contact and gradual divergence rather than sharp boundaries. What matters is not the exact classification, but what it implies. The Dacians were part of the same deep linguistic web that connected much of ancient Europe. They were not an outlier civilization speaking an alien tongue. Belief systems add another layer. Ancient sources describe the Dacians as having a strong spiritual tradition centered on a figure known as Zalmoxis. Here, interpretation becomes complicated. Some accounts portray Zalmoxis as a god associated with immortality. Others suggest he may have been a human teacher, later elevated to divine status. Scholars still debate this point. What is clear is that Dacian religion emphasized ideas of continuity beyond death, which may help explain the calm resolve Roman writers sometimes attributed to Dacian warriors. Faith shaped identity, and identity shaped how this society endured pressure from outside forces. Taken together, these elements form a picture that refuses to stay small. Fortresses, metallurgy, trade, language, and belief all point to a civilization with depth and resilience. This was not a culture waiting to be overwritten. It was one capable of absorbing influence while maintaining coherence. And that raises an unsettling question. If the Dacians were this established, this integrated, and this connected, how likely is it that they simply vanished after Rome's conquest? Archaeology could suggest continuity. Historical records could hint at survival. But none of it could answer the question with certainty. Not until a new kind of evidence emerged, one that does not rely on texts or ruins, but on the most intimate archive of all, the human body itself. For most of history, the dead were beyond questioning. Bones could tell you age, injury, maybe disease, but never ancestry in any precise sense. That changed only recently. Ancient DNA, often shortened to aDNA, is the science of extracting genetic material from human remains that can be hundreds or even thousands of years old. It sounds straightforward, but it is anything but. DNA degrades over time. Heat, moisture, bacteria, and even the soil itself break it apart. In many ancient skeletons, almost nothing survives. What does remain is fragile, fragmented, and easily contaminated by modern DNA. For decades, the technology simply was not good enough to separate ancient signal from modern noise. The breakthrough came from knowing where to look. Teeth and dense bones, especially parts of the inner ear, protect DNA better than most of the skeleton. These areas act like tiny vaults, sealing genetic material away from the environment. Even then, extracting usable DNA requires clean rooms, protective suits, and extreme caution. A single modern skin cell can ruin a sample. This is why serious aDNA research happens in specialized labs, not ordinary classrooms. It also explains why studies of ancient populations like the Dacians are only appearing now. The science had to catch up with the questions. Once extracted, ancient DNA is read in fragments, like shredded pages of a book. Computers then piece these fragments together and compare them to genetic data from other ancient and modern populations. This comparison is where meaning begins to emerge. But to understand what scientists are actually comparing, it helps to simplify the different types of DNA they analyze. Think of autosomal DNA as your main genetic mix. It comes from all your ancestors and reshuffles every generation. It tells broad stories about shared ancestry and population movement. This is the most informative for understanding ancient populations as groups. Then there is mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, which you inherit only from your mother. It changes slowly and is useful for tracing maternal lines over long periods of time. On the other side is Y-DNA, passed from father to son, which tracks paternal lines. Each type answers a different question. Autosomal DNA asks who mixed with whom. mtDNA asks where maternal lines persisted or shifted. Y-DNA asks the same for male lines. None of them alone tells the full story, but together they form a layered picture. It is important to understand what aDNA does not do. It does not assign modern national identities to ancient people. It does not label anyone as pure or unchanged. Instead, it reveals patterns, overlaps, and shifts. It shows how populations relate to each other statistically, not emotionally. This is where misunderstanding often begins. When people hear about ancient DNA, they expect clean answers. In reality, the results are probabilistic and context-dependent. They must be interpreted alongside archaeology and history, not in isolation. For regions like ancient Dacia, this approach is especially powerful. Written sources are biased. Archaeology is uneven. But DNA, when carefully handled, bypasses both. It can reveal whether populations were replaced, absorbed, or continued with modification. It can show whether conquest meant disappearance or integration. And when the first genetic data from Dacian-era burials began to appear, researchers noticed something that did not fit the old narrative of erasure. When scientists began analyzing ancient genomes from Dacian-era and nearby Balkan contexts, they did not find a single uniform genetic signature. Instead, they found layers. This should not have been surprising, but it was still revealing. Across Europe, most ancient populations can be described very broadly as mixtures of three deep ancestry components. The first traces back to ancient hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe before agriculture. The second comes from early Neolithic farmers who spread from the Near East thousands of years ago. The third is related to steppe populations that expanded during the Bronze Age. These are not ethnic labels. They are deep genetic currents that shaped nearly everyone on the continent. What stood out in the Dacian and wider Balkan region was not the presence of these components, but their balance and variability. This area has always been a crossroads between Central Europe, the Eurasian steppe, and the Mediterranean world. Geography made isolation almost impossible. River valleys, mountain passes, and trade routes all funneled movement through this zone. As a result, genetic profiles from ancient individuals in this region can differ noticeably from one site to another, even within the same general period. There was no single Dacian genetic formula. There was a spectrum. In some datasets, Dacian-era individuals show strong overlap with other ancient Balkan and Thracian-associated groups. This does not mean they were the same people, but it suggests long-term interaction and shared ancestry. These overlaps appear in autosomal profiles, where overall genetic similarity is measured rather than single lineages. The pattern fits what archaeology already hinted at. Cultural boundaries existed, but they were porous. People married across them. Communities absorbed newcomers. Identity was lived locally, not enforced biologically. Occasionally, researchers also detect minor signals that point toward ancestry related to regions farther east or south, sometimes described as Anatolian, Caucasus, or Iranian-related in genetic modeling. These signals are usually small and not present in every sample. Their interpretation varies between studies. Some see them as echoes of ancient migrations tied to early farming expansions. Others link them to later movements or long-distance connections. What matters is the caution with which these findings are treated. They are described as minor components in some analyses, not defining traits. This complexity matters because it dismantles a simplistic story. The Dacians were neither genetically isolated nor suddenly introduced from a single outside source. They emerged within a dynamic landscape shaped by thousands of years of movement and mixture. Their genetic profiles reflect that history. They look like a population formed at a meeting point, not a dead end. And that challenges the old assumption that conquest by Rome must have meant replacement. If Dacian genomes already show diversity and overlap before Rome arrived, then what happened after conquest becomes an even more interesting question. Did Rome overwrite this mosaic, or did it add new tiles to an already complex picture? The answer, it turns out, is far more subtle than simple domination. Because the year that officially ended Dacia's independence did not end its genetic story. In many ways, it accelerated it. In 106 CE, Rome did not just win a war, it rewired a region. After 2 brutal campaigns, Emperor Trajan defeated the Dacian king Decebalus, bringing an independent Dacian state to an end. Ancient sources describe the conflict as fierce and costly, which alone tells us something important. Rome did not struggle this hard against societies it considered marginal. Dacia mattered. Its fortresses, resources, and strategic position demanded a decisive response. When Decebalus was finally cornered, he chose death over capture, a moment Rome immortalized as proof of absolute victory. But political victory and human reality are rarely the same thing. Following the conquest, Dacia was reorganized as a Roman province. Roads were built, towns expanded, mining operations intensified, especially in gold-rich areas. The Roman army established a permanent presence, not just as a fighting force, but as an engine of administration and economy. Veterans were settled on land, craftspeople arrived, merchants followed the soldiers. This was not a single wave of outsiders replacing locals. It was a layered process that unfolded over generations. From a genetic perspective, this kind of integration leaves subtle traces. In some Roman-era burials from the region, researchers observed the appearance of new genetic lineages that were rare or absent before conquest. These do not point to one dominant source. Instead, they reflect the diversity of the Roman Empire itself. Soldiers and settlers came from many provinces, from the Balkans to Central Europe and beyond. As a result, genetic input during this period varies by location. Urban centers show different patterns than rural sites. Mining zones differ from frontier settlements. There is no single Roman genetic signature stamped across the landscape. What is just as important is what does not disappear. Many local genetic profiles continue into the Roman period with little disruption. This suggests that large portions of the Dacian population remained in place. They adapted to new political structures rather than being removed. Romanization in this sense was not a biological reset. It was a cultural and administrative overlay applied to an existing population. Latin may have spread. Architecture may have changed, but people, in many cases, stayed where they were. This challenges a deeply rooted assumption. Conquest is often imagined as a clean break, a before and after, but genetic data paints a messier picture. In Dacia, Rome did not erase the past. It connected it to a wider network. The province became a node in an empire-wide system of movement and exchange. That system increased diversity rather than flattening it. Yet Roman rule did not last forever. By the late 3rd century, pressures on the empire mounted. Military priorities shifted. Administration weakened. Eventually, Rome withdrew from Dacia as an official province. On paper, this looks like another ending. In reality, it was just another transition layered onto many before it. And the greatest test of continuity was still to come, carried on the backs of new migrations and new uncertainties. When Roman administration faded from Dacia, the land did not empty out. It changed hands, shifted alliances, and absorbed new arrivals. Late antiquity and the early medieval period brought waves of movement across Eastern Europe. Goths passed through. Huns reshaped political landscapes. Later, Slavic-speaking groups spread widely across the Balkans. In traditional historical narratives, these movements are often described as overwhelming floods, sweeping away what came before. But once again, genetics tells a more measured story. Movement does not always mean replacement. Often, it means layering. Archaeology already hinted at this. Many rural settlements show continuity in location and basic lifeways, even as material culture evolved. Farming did not stop. Local networks persisted. What changed were the names, the power structures, and the cultural markers we use to label periods. Genetics supports this view. In regions associated with former Dacia, ancient DNA from later centuries often preserves ancestry components seen in earlier populations, alongside new ones. The old does not vanish. It becomes part of a larger mixture. The arrival of new groups left genetic traces, but those traces are uneven. Some areas show stronger signals associated with steppe-related or Slavic-linked ancestry. Others remain closer to earlier Balkan profiles. This variation mirrors geography and settlement patterns. River corridors and open plains facilitated movement. Mountain zones tended to preserve more continuity. There is no single post-Roman genetic outcome. Instead, there is a patchwork, shaped by where people could move easily and where communities remained relatively stable. This idea of continuity plus mixture is crucial. It breaks the false choice between survival and disappearance. A population does not need to remain genetically identical to remain historically meaningful. Change does not equal loss. The Dacian genetic substrate, already diverse before Rome, was resilient enough to absorb new influences without dissolving entirely. Over centuries, it became harder to point to anything that could be labeled purely Dacian. But that does not mean Dacian ancestry ended. It means it diffused. This diffusion also explains why later historical sources struggle to define clear boundaries. As languages shifted and identities reformed, older labels lost relevance. People identified with villages, regions, or emerging political entities, not ancient tribal names. Genetics, however, does not forget those older layers. It preserves them as statistical signals, detectable even when cultural memory fades. What emerges from this period is not a story of erasure, but of survival through transformation. The Dacians did not endure as a frozen identity. They endured as people. Their descendants spoke new languages, followed new customs, and lived under new rulers. Yet beneath those changes, parts of the genetic landscape remained surprisingly familiar. And that raises a question that moves us from the past into the present. If ancient layers persist this long, can we still see their echoes today? Comparing ancient DNA to modern populations is one of the most sensitive steps in this kind of research. It is also one of the most misunderstood. Scientists do not look for direct descendants in a simple one-to-one sense. Instead, they compare patterns. When ancient samples from Dacian era and neighboring contexts are placed alongside modern genetic data, certain shared ancestry components appear more frequently in people living in Romania and nearby Balkan regions than in more distant parts of Europe. This does not mean modern populations are unchanged replicas of the ancient past. It means some deep genetic layers have remained locally concentrated over time. These shared components reflect long-term regional continuity, not isolated survival. They sit alongside ancestry introduced during Roman rule, later migrations, and medieval expansions. Modern genomes are palimpsests, written and rewritten over thousands of years. In that sense, seeing overlap with ancient Dacian-era profiles is not proof of direct descent. It is evidence that ancient populations contributed to the genetic pool that later populations inherited. Contribution, not ownership, is the correct framework. Researchers are careful to emphasize the limits of current data. Ancient samples from Dacia are still relatively few, and they come from specific sites that may not represent the entire region. Burial practices, preservation conditions, and excavation history all shape what ends up in a lab. This creates geographic and social bias. Urban centers, elite burials, or well-preserved cemeteries are more likely to be sampled than ordinary rural graves. Any comparison with modern populations must account for these distortions. There is also the issue of time depth. Modern populations are separated from ancient ones by dozens of generations. Genetic drift, later admixture, and population growth all blur the signal. This is why responsible studies avoid phrases like direct descendants. Instead, they speak of shared ancestry components and regional continuity. This language matters. It keeps the science grounded and prevents it from being pulled into modern identity politics. What the data suggests, taken cautiously, is that ancient Dacian-related ancestry did not vanish after Rome or later migrations. It became part of the genetic background of the region. This background is not exclusive to any one modern nation. Similar components appear, in varying proportions, across neighboring Balkan populations. This reflects shared history rather than isolated lineage. Borders shifted. People did not. This perspective reframes the Dacian question. Instead of asking who owns the Dacians, a better question is how their legacy survived through connection. The answer seems to be through continuity blended with openness, through staying, adapting, and mixing, through becoming unrecognizable as a separate label, yet persistent as a biological contribution. And once you see that pattern here, it becomes impossible not to notice it elsewhere in Europe. The Dacians are not an exception. They are a case study, one that forces us to rethink how European history itself is mapped. For a long time, the map of European history has been drawn with heavy lines around the west and center, and lighter ones everywhere else. Regions like the Balkans and Eastern Europe were treated as margins, places where history happened to people rather than being shaped by them. The genetic story emerging from ancient Dacia challenges that map. It shows that this region was not a passive corridor. It was an active zone of formation where multiple ancestral streams met, mixed, and persisted. In other words, it was not Europe's edge. It was one of its engines. This matters because it changes how we interpret movement. Migration is often imagined as a force that wipes out what came before, but DNA evidence across Europe, including in Dacia, suggests something different. Most migrations added layers rather than replacing foundations. The deep ancestry components that formed early European populations continued to resurface in new combinations. The Dacian case makes this visible because it sits at the intersection of so many roots. When you see continuity there, despite conquest and upheaval, it becomes harder to argue that other regions were completely reset by history. Ancient DNA does not replace archaeology or written sources. It corrects their blind spots. Texts tell us how elites wanted events remembered. Archaeology shows us how people lived and built. DNA reveals who mixed with whom and when, even when no one wrote it down. When all three align, our confidence grows. When they diverge, new questions appear. In Dacia, genetics supports archaeological hints of continuity and complicates textual narratives of disappearance. It does not contradict history. It deepens it. There is also a broader lesson here about identity. European populations were never sealed containers. They were open systems. The idea of static, ancient peoples preserved unchanged into the modern world is not supported by the data. What survives is not purity, but connection. The Dacians matter not because they can be claimed, but because they illustrate how cultures and populations endure through mixture rather than isolation. This shift has consequences beyond academia. It affects how people understand belonging, heritage, and difference. When the past is seen as dynamic and shared, it becomes harder to use it as a weapon in the present. The Dacians stop being a symbol to fight over and become a reminder of how intertwined human histories really are. And that brings us to the final turn in this story. Because the rebirth of the Dacians through DNA was never meant to redraw borders or crowns. It was meant to do something quieter and far more unsettling. The rebirth of the Dacians was never meant to belong to one flag, one language, or one modern name. It emerged from laboratories, not monuments, from sequences, not slogans. Ancient DNA turns bones into data, and data into whispers. Whispers that say this: you were never as alone in history as you thought. From stone fortresses to digital genomes, the Dacians traveled a long way to tell us something simple and unsettling. They did not vanish. They transformed. And in doing so, they became part of something much larger than themselves. When scientists compare fragments of ancient genomes to those of living people, they are not summoning ghosts. They are tracing continuity through change. Every genome is a mosaic, a record of countless meetings, migrations, and choices made by people who never knew they were shaping the future. The Dacians are not reborn as a nation. They are reborn as evidence. Evidence that history is not a series of clean breaks, but a long negotiation between persistence and adaptation. There is something humbling in this realization. The past does not belong to us to claim. It belongs to itself. DNA does not care about myths, borders, or pride. It records survival in the most honest way possible, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when technology catches up to memory. And when that moment arrives, it does not shout. It simply reveals connections that were always there. The story of the Dacians reminds us that civilizations do not need to be remembered by name to matter. They live on in patterns, in shared ancestry components, in the genetic background of regions shaped by thousands of years of movement. Their legacy is not a straight line. It is a web, and that web stretches far beyond ancient Dacia, far beyond Europe, into the shared human story. So tonight, as this chapter closes, leave yourself with 3 questions. What parts of your own history exist beyond written memory? How many vanished peoples still speak through your DNA without your knowing? And if identity is shaped by mixture, not purity, what does that mean for how we see each other now? From stone to sequence, from silence to signal. Thank you for listening. Good night.